When an entitled HOA president demands my private dock for her party, one word, no, ignites a week-long war of petty rules, sabotage, and chaos that'll leave you speechless.
Are you insane or just plain rude?
The HOA president screeched at the top of her lungs as she stomped across my dock in high heels, waving a wineglass like it was a royal scepter. The sun was setting behind her, turning the lake gold. But all I could focus on was the furious woman standing a foot away from me, demanding that her 20 out-of-town guests had the right to use my private dock for their evening party. My boat rocked slightly in the water from the commotion, and I stood there holding a dripping fishing net, staring at her in disbelief as she shrieked about community spirit, while 6 strangers in pastel polo shirts were already tying up their jet skis to my cleats like they own the place.
That was the moment my patience finally snapped, and I said, no, not a polite no. Not a maybe later.
Just a flat, cold no that made her face twitch like I just declared war. I didn't realize then that saying that one word would set off the most ridiculous, dramatic, and high-stakes week of my entire life. One that would drag every nosy neighbor, every petty HOA rule, and even the police into a spiraling circus of entitlement, revenge, and unexpected alliances. The evening had started so peacefully that it was almost laughable in hindsight. I had spent the day fishing off my own dock, enjoying the rare quiet moment away from the constant HOA notices about lawn height, mailbox paint color, and absurdly specific trash can placement. My dock was my sanctuary. The one place where the HOA had no jurisdiction, a privately deeded slice of freedom on the lake that my late father had fought hard to secure. I was halfway through untangling my fishing net when I heard the unmistakable sound of an army of flip-flops slapping down the path toward my property. Turning, I saw HOA President Brenda marching like a general, followed by an entourage of guests dressed for some lakeside wine-tasting gala that I had definitely not been invited to. At first, I thought maybe they had taken a wrong turn. But when Brenda pointed at my dock and barked orders like she owned it, I knew trouble was brewing. Move your boat, she said. Not asked, not suggested, but commanded, as if she was queen of the lake and I was her servant. We need the space for our event. The community deserves access. She said it loud enough that all her guests, now sipping wine and taking selfies, could hear how reasonable she was being. I calmly pointed to the big private property sign nailed to the dock post, the one Brenda herself had tried to have removed twice before claiming it was unfriendly. I told her this wasn't community property. It was mine, bought and paid for, deed in my name. That's when her face morphed into a full Karen mask, eyebrows arched, lips pursed, nostrils flaring like a dragon about to unleash fire. You're being selfish, she hissed, her tone dripping with venom masked as civility, and the HOA will not tolerate selfishness. Within minutes, her guests started acting like the dock was already theirs. A guy in khakis threw me a nod and asked where he could plug in his Bluetooth speaker. 2 women in floral dresses started laying out blankets and dipping their feet into my water like it was a public pool. Every muscle in my body tightened as I told them all to leave, trying to keep my temper in check because everyone knows if you lose it first, the HOA wins. But Brenda wasn't leaving without a fight. She pulled out her phone and called the HOA vice president on speaker, ranting about how I was obstructing a community gathering, spinning a story where I was the villain. The vice president promised they'd take action, and just like that, I had a full-blown war declared over a patch of wood and water that my family had owned for decades. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, things had escalated. Brenda threatened fines, legal action, and even hinted at calling the police for harassment because I dared to tell her guests to untie their jet skis from my dock. Neighbors peeked over fences, whispers spreading faster than wildfire. My best friend Luke showed up with a beer in one hand and a confused look on his face,
asking why a yacht club was assembling on my property. I didn't have an answer beyond the fact that our HOA president had decided her party mattered more than my rights. I stood there in the fading light, every nerve buzzing, as Brenda promised that if I didn't comply tonight, tomorrow would be worse. I didn't know then how right she was. That single refusal would lead to a week-long battle involving HOA board meetings that felt like courtroom dramas, fake emergency bylaw changes designed to corner me, sabotage attempts on my dock, alliances formed with neighbors I thought hated me, and even a viral video that turned our sleepy lakeside neighborhood into a national laughingstock. But standing there in that moment, Brenda's face flushed red, wineglass trembling, her guests glaring at me like I'd stolen Christmas, I knew only one thing. This wasn't just about a dock. This was about standing up to a bully who thought rules didn't apply to her. And I wasn't about to give her an inch. What I didn't realize was that saying no to her that night wouldn't just start a feud. It would ignite absolute chaos that would push every limit of patience, logic, and sanity, and end in a way nobody on that lake would ever forget. The morning after the dock incident felt like waking up in the middle of a battlefield where the enemy had already started plotting while I slept. My phone buzzed with notifications from neighbors. Some laughing about the spectacle Brenda had made of herself last night, others warning me that the HOA group chat was on fire, painting me as the villain who ruined a community celebration. I rolled out of bed, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and stepped out to my porch only to find 3 bright yellow HOA violation notices taped to my front door like trophies. Apparently, overnight, Brenda and her board had decided my lawn was unsightly, my mailbox non-compliant, and my dock a hazard to community access, which was ironic considering it had been perfectly fine until Brenda decided to treat it like her personal marina. The petty war had begun, and it was clear she wasn't planning to stop at yelling on my dock. She wanted a full-scale character assassination, the kind where they drown you in fines and rumors until you cave just to breathe again. By noon, I was at my friend Luke's place, explaining what had gone down in detail as he tried not to choke on his sandwich from laughing so hard. She actually brought guests onto your dock without asking, he said, wiping tears from his eyes. That's like walking into someone's kitchen and cooking dinner on their stove because you like the view. His amusement gave me some relief. But it didn't change the reality that Brenda was escalating. The HOA board had called an emergency meeting scheduled for that evening to address dock access rights, which was their fancy way of saying they were going to try and twist the rules to make my private property theirs. Luke offered to come as backup, but I knew Brenda would turn it into a circus no matter what. If I went alone, they'd try to bully me into agreeing. If I brought someone, they'd accuse me of turning it into a spectacle. There was no winning, but I wasn't about to let her walk all over me. The hours leading up to that meeting were tense. I caught Brenda walking up and down the lakefront with a clipboard, talking to every neighbor she could corner, spinning tales about how I was hoarding the dock and preventing the community from enjoying the lake. Some neighbors gave me sympathetic looks. Others avoided eye contact, clearly not wanting to pick sides in a fight they knew would get ugly. One older guy, Mr. Thompson, muttered to me that Brenda had tried to pull a similar stunt years ago, but backed down when someone threatened to sue. That little piece of information stuck in my head like a weapon I might need later. The HOA meeting that night was everything I expected and worse. The clubhouse was packed. Brenda sitting at the front like a queen on her throne, surrounded by her loyal board members. As soon as I walked in, conversations hushed and eyes turned to me like I just strolled into enemy territory. Brenda wasted no time slamming her gavel and launching into a speech about community harmony and shared resources, painting a picture where my private dock was a selfish barrier preventing neighborhood unity.
I tried to speak to explain that the dock was legally mine, not community property. But every time I opened my mouth, Brenda interrupted with fake gasps, exaggerated sighs, and smug comments about how I clearly didn't care about anyone but myself. At one point, a board member suggested creating an emergency bylaw to designate temporary shared dock usage during community events, essentially rewriting the rules to take what was mine. I pointed out that this was illegal, but Brenda countered with her classic line about spirit over letter of the law, and a few of her cronies clapped like trained seals. Luke texted me mid-meeting, "You need a lawyer. This is insane." And he was right. Brenda was playing dirty, twisting words, weaponizing neighborly guilt to get her way. The only thing saving me from being bulldozed entirely was a surprising moment halfway through, when an unexpected ally spoke up. Mrs. Green, a quiet older neighbor who rarely attended these meetings, stood up and said she remembered my father buying and legally fencing off the dock years ago, after a long battle with the original developer. She reminded everyone that the property line was indisputable, that Brenda had no authority over it, and that trying to force shared access was asking for a lawsuit the HOA would lose. The room went tense, Brenda's fake smile faltering for the first time all night. She tried to regain control with a snide comment about old memories not matching modern needs, but the damage was done. A few people started murmuring about legal fees, suddenly less enthusiastic about Brenda's crusade. Of course, Brenda didn't take the blow gracefully. The second the meeting ended, she cornered me outside, dropping the sugary facade and hissing threats about how this wasn't over, how I'd regret making her look bad in front of her board. She promised to make my life hell. And judging by the gleam in her eyes, she meant it. Luke and I walked back to my place, already half joking about installing security cameras. But deep down, I knew the fight had only just begun. Brenda was the kind of person who thrived on control, and I had just stripped her of a victory she thought was guaranteed. There was no way she'd let it go. That night, as I sat on my dock under the stars, I realized this was no longer just about property rights. Brenda wanted power, and saying no to her was like challenging a dictator. She'd use every trick in the HOA playbook to get what she wanted. Fines, smear campaigns, even fabricated violations. And if she couldn't win legally, she'd settle for making my life miserable until I gave in. But what she didn't know was that I had no intention of folding, no matter how far she took this. What I also didn't know was how far she was willing to go to win, and how many lines she was about to cross in the days ahead, dragging this neighborhood into chaos no one could have predicted. The calm lake water lapped softly against my dock, as if mocking me with its serenity, completely unaware that this quiet little community was about to turn into a battlefield where the rules of civility would be shredded, alliances would be tested, and every petty feud would explode into something much darker than anyone expected. The following day started deceptively calm, as if the universe was giving me a false sense of peace before throwing me straight into another whirlwind of HOA madness. I woke up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat on the porch staring out at my dock, which thankfully remained unoccupied. The stillness of the lake almost made me believe that maybe Brenda had finally realized how ridiculous her little crusade was. But I should have known better. Brenda didn't back down, she retaliated. And sure enough, around mid-morning, I heard the distinct sound of high heels clacking against the pavement outside my house, followed by loud, exaggerated sighs meant to draw my attention. When I stepped outside, there she was, clipboard in hand, flanked by two other HOA board members like she was leading some sort of inspection SWAT team. They didn't even bother with pleasantries. Brenda announced loudly that they were there to address urgent violations, which turned out to be the
most laughable list of fabricated nonsense I had ever heard. My mailbox
suddenly was a safety hazard because its color allegedly distracted drivers.
My
grass, which had been trimmed 2 days ago, was overgrown and attracting pests. And the new one, my personal favorite, was that my dock railing was illegally obstructing community access, despite having a private property sign nailed to it in bold letters. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream, but I chose to calmly remind her that harassment was not an HOA right.
Brenda responded with
a fake smile so tight it looked painful and muttered just loud enough for me to hear that people who don't play nice in
this neighborhood don't last long. Luke came over shortly after they left, shaking his head at the stack of
violation notices they had taped to my door like wanted posters. She's unhinged, he said, scanning them one by
one.
It's like she's trying to build a legal case out of thin air.
We both knew
what this was.
Intimidation, pure and simple. She was banking on me getting
scared of mounting fines or losing patience, and letting her have her way. But fear wasn't in the cards for me
anymore. If anything, her desperation only strengthened my resolve. Still, I wasn't naive enough to think I could keep playing defense forever. That afternoon, I made a call to an attorney recommended by Mr. Thompson, the same neighbor who told me about Brenda's failed dock stunt years ago. The lawyer,
a sharp and surprisingly humorous guy named David, listened to my story and laughed in disbelief more than once. She's trying to claim community access to a privately deeded dock, he said, incredulous.
That's not just illegal. That's begging for a lawsuit.
You've got the upper hand here as long as you don't lose your cool and give her something to work with. We scheduled a meeting for later in the week just in case Brenda
decided to turn her threats into formal action.
I didn't have to wait long to see what her next move would be, though. That evening, while I was grilling on the back deck, music suddenly blared from across the street, loud enough to
make the windows vibrate. It wasn't just music. It was deliberate noise. Ear-splitting country rock that I knew Brenda couldn't possibly enjoy, which made it obvious it was meant for me. As
the bass pounded, a parade of HOA board members and Brenda's friends gathered on the street, pretending to have a block
party that just happened to be facing my house. Every so often, someone would
glance my way, laugh loudly, and shout something about sharing the lake or
community fun.
It was like a bad high school prank, except these were full-grown adults acting like toddlers,
throwing tantrums. Luke showed up halfway through, shaking his head and muttering that we'd officially entered psychological warfare territory.
We tried to ignore it, cranking up our own
music to drown them out, but Brenda wasn't done. As night fell, someone left
another bright yellow notice taped to my mailbox,
this time citing me for
creating neighborhood discord, which I had to admit was impressively ironic given the circus they just staged
outside my house.
By the third day, Brenda's tactics had shifted from noise and fake fines to outright sabotage. I came down to my dock in the morning to find scratches on the wood, one of the ropes securing my boat mysteriously untied, and a plastic bag filled with empty wine bottles tossed on the deck as if to make it look like I had hosted some wild trashy party.
The message was clear. They wanted to paint me as a
nuisance, someone unworthy of owning a private dock in their perfect little community.
But what they didn't count on
was my persistence and the fact that Luke had installed a discreet security camera the night before after predicting
exactly this kind of behavior.
When we reviewed the footage, there was no mistaking it.
Two of Brenda's favorite HOA lackeys sneaking onto my dock under cover of darkness, giggling as they staged their little scene.
The video wasn't just proof of harassment.
It was ammunition. And in that moment, I knew the tide was about to turn.
I sent the footage anonymously to a few neighbors, and by noon, whispers were spreading like wildfire.
People who had been too scared to cross Brenda were suddenly looking at her differently. A few even sent me messages apologizing for believing her lies. But as satisfying as it was to watch her carefully crafted image start to crack, I also knew it made her more dangerous. Brenda wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat gracefully. If she felt power slipping through her fingers, she'd double down and probably do something reckless. Sure enough, that evening, she showed up at my property again. This time, not with a fake smile, but with full-blown fury. She stood at the edge of my dock, screaming about defamation and cyberbullying, threatening to sue me for slander because of the video making the rounds. Even though she knew damn well it was her people caught red-handed. The entire neighborhood watched from their windows, some recording, some whispering, as Brenda completely lost her composure. It was chaos, loud and absurd, but also a turning point. For the first time, it wasn't just my word against hers. People had seen her true colors, and the narrative she had built about me being the selfish villain was starting to crumble. That night, I sat on the dock with Luke, the lake calm again, despite the storm Brenda had tried to stir. We talked about next steps, about sending the footage to David, about what Brenda might try next now that public opinion wasn't entirely on her side anymore. I should have felt relieved, but a gnawing sense of unease lingered. Brenda wasn't finished. She was too invested, too obsessed with winning this battle to back down. And if there was one thing I had learned about entitled people like her, it was that when they felt cornered, they got unpredictable. The war over my dock was no longer just neighborhood gossip. It was a full-blown power struggle that had taken on a life of its own, dragging in bystanders, stirring up old grudges, and setting the stage for something bigger and far messier than either of us could have imagined. The calm water glistened under the moonlight, deceptively peaceful. But I knew it was only the quiet before the next storm. Brenda was already brewing. The fourth day of this ridiculous saga began with what looked like a victory, but quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. Overnight, the video of Brenda's cronies trespassing on my dock had traveled beyond our little community chat. Someone, probably one of the neighbors sick of the HOA tyranny, had shared it on social media. By morning, my phone was blowing up with messages from friends, old classmates, even strangers sending me laughing emojis and links to posts where Brenda's little army had become the butt of nationwide joke. Headlines like HOA president's minions get busted in dock sabotage attempt were trending. And for a brief moment, I savored the sweet taste of karma. It wasn't just me anymore. The whole internet had a front row seat to Brenda's nonsense. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand. But Brenda wasn't the kind of person who could handle public humiliation. She thrived on control, on carefully curating an image of power and respect. And now, with that image crumbling, I knew she would come at me harder than ever, no longer concerned about rules or appearances. By mid-morning, a black SUV rolled slowly past my house, stopping long enough for me to recognize Brenda in the passenger seat, sunglasses on, face set in a mask of barely contained rage. She didn't step out, didn't shout anything this time, but that look was enough to send a chill down my spine. Luke joked about me needing body armor, but even he admitted this was getting out of hand. The neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. Some people cheered me on, whispering that it was about time someone stood up to Brenda, while others worried this feud was going to spill into something uglier than HOA fines and dock rights. They weren't wrong. That evening, Brenda made her move, one that proved just how unhinged and reckless she had become in her desperation to win. It started with a fake emergency HOA meeting notice slipped into every mailbox on our street, claiming that due to legal violations by a homeowner, Urgent action must be taken to preserve community safety.
I only found out about it because Mrs. Green knocked on my door, concerned that Brenda was trying to rally the neighborhood to vote on some new bylaw targeting me.
I hadn't
even processed the insanity of it all before Luke called, telling me that Brenda was at the clubhouse already, gathering signatures to push through a temporary community dock sharing ordinance.
The audacity of it was almost impressive.
She knew she couldn't legally take my dock, so now she was
trying to trick people into thinking a neighborhood vote could override property law.
I stormed down to the clubhouse, heart pounding, and walked into a scene straight out of a bad political rally.
Brenda stood at the front with a microphone, dramatically declaring that selfishness was destroying our once harmonious
community, while her loyalists clapped like trained seals.
A petition was being
passed around, and frightened or confused neighbors were signing it just to avoid Brenda's wrath.
I walked
straight to the front, grabbed the microphone out of her hand, and called the entire stunt what it was: illegal
harassment.
My voice shook, not from fear, but from the sheer frustration of
having to defend what was already mine. I reminded everyone that no neighborhood vote could override private property
rights, that Brenda was lying to manipulate them, and that her tactics were now being watched by thousands
online, thanks to the viral video. For a moment, there was silence. Just the sound of Brenda's breathing quickening as her face flushed beet red.
She tried to snatch the mic back, shouting about
me, spreading slander. But this time, people didn't clap. A few neighbors even muttered that this was going too far. One man stood up and refused to sign the
petition, saying he wouldn't risk a lawsuit because Brenda wanted to host wine parties on someone else's dock.
The
spell she held over the neighborhood was cracking, and she knew it.
But Brenda wasn't about to admit defeat in public.
She stormed out of the meeting, slamming the clubhouse door so hard it rattled the windows, leaving her followers
scrambling behind her.
I should have felt triumphant, but the uneasy knot in my stomach only grew.
I knew Brenda well enough by now to understand what came next. Retaliation in private where no
one could see, where she could twist the knife without risking another viral humiliation.
That night, my fears were confirmed. Around midnight, my security camera pinged an alert. I checked the
feed and saw two figures creeping along the path to my dock.
Flashlights off, trying to stay out of sight.
This time, they weren't just throwing trash or untying rope.
One of them carried what looked like a crowbar.
My blood ran cold as I realized they were planning to damage my dock.
Maybe even sink my boat.
Anything to punish me for defying their queen. I called Luke first, then the police, heart racing as we watched from
my upstairs window.
The figures had started prying at one of the dock planks when the sound of sirens shattered the
night.
They bolted, disappearing into the darkness, but not before the security camera caught their faces clear
as day. And there she was again, Brenda's favorite lieutenant, the same woman from the last sabotage video. This time escalating to outright vandalism.
The officers took my statement, collected the footage, and promised to investigate, but the damage to my sense of safety was already done.
This wasn't just HOA pettiness anymore.
This was a full-blown vendetta, and Brenda was
willing to risk criminal charges to win it.
The next morning, news of the attempted vandalism spread fast.
Especially once the police car parked outside my house got everyone talking. Neighbors started picking sides more openly now. Some furious with Brenda for dragging the community into what was
essentially a personal obsession, others still too scared to speak up against her. Mrs. Green came by with muffins and a quiet warning that Brenda wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted or was forced to back down by someone
stronger than her.
Luke and I sat on the porch, exhausted but determined, going over plans with David, the lawyer, on speakerphone.
David promised we had more than enough evidence now to hit Brenda
and her cronies with restraining orders, lawsuits, and even press charges for
trespassing and attempted property damage.
For the first time, the law was fully on my side.
Not just morally, but legally.
And we all knew that once David made his move, Brenda's reign of terror over this dock would start to crumble. But even as we prepared for the legal showdown, I couldn't shake the feeling that Brenda had one last card up her sleeve. Something bigger, something desperate enough to try before her
entire facade collapsed.
And judging by the way she glared at me from across the street that evening, sunglasses off this time, her eyes sharp and unblinking like a predator's, I knew whatever she was planning next would be the most dangerous, dramatic, and outrageous stunt yet.
The war over my dock had turned from petty HOA nonsense into a full-scale battle of wills, one that was
about to test not just my patience and determination, but the limits of what anyone would dare to do in the name of
entitlement and power. By the time Chapter 5 of this nightmare began, the
neighborhood was split down the middle, and you could feel the tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break.
Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. Not just curious glances, but full-on
stares, as if everyone was wondering what Brenda would do next, and whether I would finally give in or burn the entire
HOA circus to the ground with a single lawsuit.
Brenda had gone strangely quiet since the failed sabotage attempt. But it wasn't the kind of silence that comes with surrender.
It was the silence of
someone plotting, sharpening knives in the dark, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
Even Luke, who usually
joked his way through everything, seemed uneasy, constantly scanning the street like he expected one of Brenda's cronies to leap out from behind a bush with another fake violation notice, or worse.
David, my lawyer, was already drafting cease and desist letters and preparing to file formal charges. But he warned me that people like Brenda didn't fight fair. And once cornered, they often made reckless moves that dragged everyone down with them.
The first sign of her next attack came on a Tuesday morning when I went down to my dock for some peace and quiet, only to find a brand new community access point sign bolted to one of my posts.
It wasn't official. Just a cheap metal sign clearly made at a print shop, but the implication was obvious. Brenda was trying to publicly
claim my dock as part of the neighborhood amenities. Moments later, a couple I barely knew strolled down the
path with towels and a cooler, acting as if the place had always been theirs.
When I confronted them, they shrugged awkwardly and said Brenda had assured everyone that a new agreement had been reached and that my dock was now open
for everyone to use. My blood boiled as I escorted them off, pointing out for
the 100th time that private property isn't subject to HOA popularity contest. But the damage was already done. Brenda was spreading her narrative again, twisting the story so that I looked like
the unreasonable recluse denying the neighborhood shared joy.
The worst part was that some people believed her, or at least pretended to, because it was easier than crossing her.
That evening, we decided to go on the offensive.
David joined Luke and me at my kitchen table. Stacks of documents and photos laid out like we were preparing for trial.
We had proof of harassment, sabotage, trespassing, defamation, and now outright fraud with the fake sign. David
drafted a letter threatening a massive lawsuit against Brenda personally and against the HOA if they continued their campaign to steal access to my dock. It was a masterpiece of legal precision and
brutal truth. The kind of letter that made even seasoned bullies hesitate. We
sent copies to every board member and hand-delivered one to Brenda's house. She read it on her porch, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that looked dangerously close to panic.
But then, instead of backing down, she doubled down. The very next day, a new rumor started circulating.
Brenda was telling anyone who would listen that my dock was unsafe, that it had structural issues and posed a danger to the community, implying that the HOA might have to condemn it for public safety.
It was laughable given the pristine condition of the dock. But Brenda knew that fear spread faster than truth. Within hours, I had county inspectors showing up, clearly tipped off by someone who thought they were reporting a legitimate hazard. The inspectors took one look, laughed at the absurdity, and left. But the message was clear. Brenda was willing to drag in outside authorities, waste their time, and tarnish my reputation just to win. Luke joked that at this rate, next she'd be calling the Coast Guard, but neither of us was really laughing. As the week dragged on, the mind games escalated. Brenda started mailing anonymous letters to neighbors accusing me of being unstable and aggressive, trying to make me out as a threat to community harmony. She stood on her lawn loudly speculating about how I must have something to hide. If I was so desperate to keep the dock to myself. And then came the biggest twist of all. Brenda announced she was hosting a massive community lake festival that weekend and promised unrestricted dock access for all. Flyers went up everywhere. Invitations slipped under doors. And suddenly I was facing the prospect of dozens of people showing up expecting to use my dock because Brenda had promised it to them. It was insanity, a direct challenge to my boundaries designed to force a confrontation in front of the entire neighborhood. Luke wanted to set up barricades and blast heavy metal music to scare people off. But David had a smarter idea. We would prepare for the festival like we were going to war, but legally and strategically. We documented everything, hired a private security guard to stand at the entrance to my property, and set up cameras from every angle. We even printed copies of the property deed to hand out to anyone Brenda misled. By the time Saturday came, I was exhausted but ready, knowing Brenda's stunt would either backfire spectacularly or turn into the ugliest HOA showdown yet. The day of the festival was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. Dozens of families showed up with picnic baskets and floaties, looking confused when they saw a security guard at my driveway. Brenda arrived last dressed like she was hosting a royal gala, barking orders and declaring that the community has rights. When people started asking why my dock was closed, I calmly handed out copies of the deed and explained that Brenda had lied to them. Murmurs turned to whispers. Whispers turned to outright laughter. And before long, most of the crowd realized they'd been duped. Brenda tried to save face, shouting about selfishness and tradition, but no one was buying it anymore. Her carefully constructed illusion of control was crumbling in real time. And for once, it wasn't just me calling her out. It was everyone she had manipulated. The confrontation ended with Brenda screaming that this wasn't over, that the board would find a way before storming off in humiliation. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to cross her approached me quietly, some apologizing, some offering support. Others sharing their own stories of her bullying tactic. It felt like the tide was finally turning. Like Brenda's iron grip on the neighborhood was slipping. But as Luke pointed out later that evening, people like Brenda didn't let go. They struck back harder when they felt power slipping away. As much as I wanted to believe this was the beginning of the end, deep down I knew Brenda wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. She would regroup, plot in secret, and come back with a vengeance, ready to push the fight to a level none of us had seen before. And I had to be prepared because this battle over my dock had stopped being about property long ago. It had become a war over control, reputation, and the lengths an entitled person would go to just to get their way, no matter who they had to crush in the process. I thought the Lake Festival fiasco might finally be the moment where Brenda realized she had lost, that the neighborhood had seen through her lies and her obsession with my dock had turned her into a laughingstock. But instead of retreating, Brenda disappeared for 2 full days. And that silence was more unsettling than all her screaming, fake violations, and sabotage attempts combined.
Luke kept saying this was the calm before the storm, that Brenda was somewhere plotting her next outrageous stunt. And unfortunately, he was right. On the third morning, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail stamped with the HOA seal. Inside was a formal notice of a special board meeting scheduled in 48 hours to vote on emergency reclassification of private waterfront structures for community welfare. It was a long-winded bureaucratic way of saying they were about to try to rewrite the rules to claim my dock legally, twisting the HOA charter in ways that would make lawyers' heads spin. David nearly laughed when he read it, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurdly desperate. He explained that no HOA could override private deeds like mine. But Brenda was banking on intimidation, on making it seem official enough that I would cave or that neighbors would side with her to avoid more drama. The days leading up to the meeting were thick with tension. Brenda went door to door again, promising neighbors that once the dock was community property, everyone could enjoy it, painting me as some selfish villain hoarding access to the lake. People I barely knew started giving me dirty looks, clearly swayed by her relentless narrative. At one point, Luke caught Brenda in my driveway pretending to measure the property line, trying to make it look like there was some legal ambiguity. We chased her off, but it only made her laugh. This unsettling, confident laugh that made me realize she had some kind of ace up her sleeve. I spent that entire night with David going through every possible scenario, preparing statements, gathering every shred of evidence of harassment, vandalism, trespassing, and manipulation. This wasn't just about my dock anymore. This was about showing Brenda she couldn't bend reality to suit her ego, no matter how many fake laws she invented. When the night of the meeting came, the clubhouse was packed again. But this time, the atmosphere was electric, more like a courtroom drama than a neighborhood gathering. Brenda strutted in first, wearing a power suit that screamed authority, flanked by her most loyal board members. She took the center of the room and immediately started her performance, clutching papers like sacred texts, declaring that, for the good of the community, they had to vote to reclassify my dock. She spoke of fairness, unity, safety concerns, anything she thought might sway the crowd. But then came the real twist. Brenda claimed she had a legal expert backing her up, and in walked a man in a cheap suit who claimed to be a property consultant waving around a stack of dubious documents suggesting there was historical precedent for shared dock access. It was laughable and infuriating. All at once, but I stayed quiet, letting her dig her hole deeper, because David had told me exactly how to dismantle this circus when the time came. When I finally stood up to speak, I handed out copies of the original deed, proving beyond doubt that my dock was privately owned, not community property, and I calmly outlined every illegal stunt Brenda had pulled to try and take it. I didn't yell. I didn't lose my temper. I just laid out the facts like David had coached me, one after another. Each one a nail in the coffin of Brenda's argument. Then David himself stood and in front of the entire board in half. The neighborhood made it clear that if they attempted to vote on something that directly violated state property laws, they would all be personally liable for damages in the inevitable lawsuit. He held up copies of police reports, security footage of the sabotage, and even a list of Brenda's fake violation notices, calling them harassment. The room went silent except for the sound of Brenda's breathing getting louder and angrier. Her so-called consultant started sweating bullets, clearly realizing he'd been dragged into a losing battle. But Brenda wasn't done. Desperation makes people reckless, and she proved it by snapping in front of everyone. She pointed at me and screamed about how I was destroying the community, that people like me ruin neighborhoods because we couldn't share. She ranted about how she had worked too hard building her little empire to let someone like me embarrass her. At one point, she even accused me of bribing the lawyer and the police just to humiliate her.
a wild claim that made even her own board members look at her sideways. It was the first crack in her armor I had seen in public. The moment where people started to see the real Brenda, not a dedicated HOA president, but a power-hungry bully who couldn't stand losing. The vote never happened. The board, terrified of legal repercussions, tabled the motion indefinitely. Neighbors started murmuring about recalling Brenda as president, some openly suggesting she had gone too far and needed to step down. Brenda stormed out of the meeting in a fury, slamming doors, shouting that this wasn't over. As Luke and I left, several neighbors patted me on the back, finally seeing me not as the villain Brenda had painted me to be, but as the guy standing up to tyranny. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope that this nightmare was nearing its end. But as we walked back to my house, under the dim streetlights, Luke pointed out something that chilled me. Brenda hadn't just lost. She had been humiliated. And humiliation for someone like her wasn't the end of a fight. It was gasoline on a fire. We both knew she wouldn't sleep that night. That she would spend every second plotting revenge. Not just to win the dock, but to crush me completely for daring to stand up to her. And judging by the way she glared at me from her window as we passed, her face twisted with pure hatred, I knew Luke was right. The war over my dock wasn't ending. It was about to hit its most dangerous and unpredictable stage yet, where Brenda had nothing left to lose, and no line she wouldn't cross to get what she wanted. The final chapter of this absurd war over my dock began with an eerie quiet that should have felt like relief, but instead carried the heavy weight of anticipation, like the calm before a storm you know is coming, but can't predict where it will strike. After Brenda's public meltdown at the last HOA meeting, the neighborhood had turned against her in ways I had only dreamed of weeks ago. People whispered about voting her out. Some openly confronted her about the harassment campaign she had run against me, and others went so far as to apologize to me for believing her lies. On the surface, it looked like the fight was finally over. But I had spent too many sleepless nights dealing with Brenda's schemes to believe she would ever let this go quietly. Brenda wasn't just obsessed with my dock anymore. She was obsessed with destroying me because I had done the one thing she couldn't tolerate. I had beaten her at her own game in front of everyone and stripped her of the power she craved. That kind of humiliation doesn't fade. It festers. And as much as I wanted peace, I knew she wasn't finished. Luke came over early that morning with a box of donuts and a grim look on his face, saying he had heard whispers that Brenda was planning something big, one last stunt to regain control before the neighborhood voted on her removal as HOA president. My lawyer, David, warned me the same thing when he called an hour later, saying Brenda had filed a bizarre complaint with the county claiming my dock violated environmental laws. A move that would never hold up, but would drag me into weeks of unnecessary hearings if left unchecked. It was classic Brenda. Throw mud and hope something sticks, no matter how absurd. We spent half the day preparing responses, making calls, gathering every shred of evidence to crush this latest attack before it gained traction. By evening, I felt mentally drained, but also strangely ready. Because if Brenda wanted one last showdown, I was done playing defense. I wasn't just going to protect what was mine anymore. I was going to end this fight for good. The confrontation came faster than expected. That night, as the sun dipped below the lake, I heard shouting outside, followed by the roar of multiple engines. I stepped onto my porch to see a caravan of cars pulling up along the street. Brenda at the front waving her arms like a commander leading troops into battle. Out spilled a mix of HOA loyalists and a handful of out-of-town guests I recognized from her earlier dock invasion. They were hauling coolers, portable speakers, and enough lake gear to outfit a small marina.
Brenda marched straight toward my property, a smug grin plastered on her face, shouting that the community had decided to celebrate by the lake and that I had no right to deny them access. It was a full-scale invasion attempt. One last desperate bid to seize my dock. By sheer force of numbers, hoping public spectacle would scare me into surrender. But this time, I was ready. Luke and I had set up bright floodlights along the path. Security cameras were rolling and David himself was on site with a stack of legal documents ready to hand out like party favors. As Brenda reached the entrance to my dock, I calmly stepped forward, holding up a court-issued temporary restraining order I had obtained earlier that day, preventing her or any of her cronies from setting foot on my property. When she tried to laugh it off and step forward anyway, David loudly informed her and the crowd that crossing onto my dock now would mean immediate arrest for trespassing in violation of a legal order. The crowd hesitated, whispers rippling through the group as people realized this wasn't another one of Brenda's bluffs or neighborhood squabbles. This was the law speaking, not just me. Brenda, cornered and furious, tried to rally her troops, shouting that I was lying, that the order was fake, that this was my attempt to silence the community. But one by one, people started backing away, unwilling to risk getting arrested for Brenda's vendetta. The out-of-towners who had no stake in this neighborhood left first, embarrassed and muttering about not signing up for this kind of drama. Even some of her die-hard HOA allies walked off, suddenly more concerned about their reputations than her crusade. Brenda's face twisted with rage as her support melted away, leaving her standing there alone, screaming incoherently about fairness and sharing, her voice echoing across the lake like the rant of a tyrant whose kingdom had finally crumbled. When she tried to push past me anyway, the police, who David had wisely called ahead of time, pulled up with sirens flashing. They stepped out, reviewed the restraining order, and calmly informed Brenda that if she set one foot on my property, she would be taken into custody immediately. For a long moment, I thought she might actually do it, that her ego was so desperate for control, she'd rather get arrested than admit defeat. But in the end, self-preservation won out. With a final scream about how this wasn't over, she stormed back to her car, peeling away into the night, leaving behind the stunned silence of a neighborhood that had finally seen their self-appointed queen stripped of power. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal for Brenda. The HOA board, tired of lawsuits, police visits, and public humiliation, voted unanimously to remove her as president. Neighbors who once feared her now avoided her entirely, ashamed of how far they'd let her go unchecked. The viral videos, police reports, and restraining order became infamous in local circles, turning Brenda into a cautionary tale of HOA power gone mad. She tried a few more petty stunts, anonymous letters, false complaints, but no one took her seriously anymore. Eventually, she sold her house and moved away, leaving behind nothing but stories of her downfall and a neighborhood finally free to breathe again. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. My dock became my sanctuary once more, a quiet place to fish, watch the sunset, and remember that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about property. It's about refusing to be bullied, no matter how loud or powerful the other side seems. Luke and I often sat out there with beers, laughing about the madness we'd survived, joking about turning it into a movie or writing a book titled Dock Wars, The Karen Chronicles. David stopped by occasionally, too, insisting that this was the wildest HOA case he'd ever seen, and that I deserved a medal for patience under siege. But even in the quiet moments, I knew this story would stick with me forever. Not just because of the chaos Brenda unleashed, but because it showed how far entitlement can go when left unchecked. How dangerous people become when their need for control outweighs logic, decency, and even the law.
The lake sparkled peacefully now.
No shouting, no trespassers, just water lapping softly against the wood of the
dock my father had fought so hard to give our family. It felt like reclaiming more than just property. It felt like
reclaiming my life, my boundaries, my right to stand up for what's mine. And as I leaned back in my chair, watching the sun sink low on the horizon, I couldn't help but think that if Brenda had simply asked instead of demanding,
none of this would have happened. But entitled people don't ask. They take until someone finally says no and means it's